for purposes of streaming in the future. So just to let you know that we will be recording this one, and we're expecting Councillor Chowns to be our first guest. So we had a couple of questions. I think there was 2 or 3 actually put forward. And if you want to actually ask them yourselves, that's something that we've been asked to do if you want to. So I'll probably just try and remember who asked. I think it was Brian who asked the first question. Given the urgency, what's the timetable? And then Brian and Trevor, I think it was, who collectively kind of asked the second one. But I'm happy to do it if you're not ready to go. And Councillor Chan's here, so welcome. Brian, do you want to do the first question, or do you want me to do it?
No, I'm happy to do it.
Great, over to you.
Okay, my question was, given the enormous urgency, what is the timeline of implementing any recommendations?
Thanks, Brian. Hello, everybody. Really good to see you. You're absolutely right, given the enormous urgency. So the council has a firm target to be zero carbon by 2030 for ourselves, and we're actually on target to achieve that. What we also want to do is to help the county as a whole to get to zero carbon by 2030, and that is a much bigger and more ambitious thing, because 99% of it is not in the direct control of the council. So in terms of what we've got to achieve, we've got to get to zero carbon by 2030, and we've got a lot of work to do to get there. In terms of implementing whatever comes out of the Climate Assembly, you know, we want to start work on that ASAP. So, for example, I mentioned the core strategy. You know, we'll have a revised core strategy by Q1 next year. I mentioned projects and new finance, and that'll be there for spending in the next financial year. So implementation would start then, but we'd have to work up the details of those projects. But all of these things are really long term as well. So, you know, we're not going to be able to change to sustainable transport. We're not going to be able to retrofit every house in Herefordshire in the next year, but we're jolly well trying to get on with it as quick as possible. Does that answer your question?
In part, yes. Where are you now then? If zero carbon is 100%, where are you now?
So we're now at, I think we're down 59% on 2005 levels, which is on a really good trajectory to get to zero. So what that's involved is things like, for example, the street lights in Hereford, throughout Herefordshire were changed a few years ago from old inefficient bulbs to LEDs, so that saved a lot of power. As a council ourselves, we switched to an entirely renewable energy source in 2019. We're now looking at things like how we can better insulate our school buildings. Our schools is the biggest portion of our carbon footprint, and we're just about to start a new schools carbon reduction programme. You'll hear more about some of these things in later sessions, of course.
There was a second question about money coming in, and I'm just conscious of your time here, Dr. Chair.
I'll get tweaked out at some point.
Yeah. So Brian and Trevor were also asking about the funding. Brian, do you want to bring that one in as well?
Yes, of course. So the £1.33 million budget that has been marked for this particular session, what percentage of the total budget is that?
Okay, so it depends how you cut the budget, and you're going to have a detailed presentation from Andrew Lovegrove, who's head of the council's finance, in the next Thursday session. Basically, the headline figures are the council spends roughly 300 million a year. But more than 100 million of that is for running schools, and that kind of comes through the council's accounts and straight out to schools, so it isn't stuff that we spend ourselves. So our base budget is about 160 million. And about 2/3 of that, more than that, is social care, so children's and adults. About 30 million of it, less than 30 million, is everything in the environment and economy area. So that's all of the road maintenance, it's all of the bin collection, it's all of the planning service, it's all of the environmental stuff, and so on and so forth. The extra money that we talked about, the 1.33 million, it will be fantastically useful, but it's not the only thing that the council can do. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about in that Thursday session, because of course, so much else of what we do is related to it. So I think the most recent calculation was that about 11 million pounds of our current expenditure is directly climate related, but there's more that we can do to expand that.
Is it easy to put a percentage figure on that out of the total budget?
Well, like I said, no, not really, because
Spread
if our
out.
total budget is 300 million,
Yeah.
but so much of that is about running schools and it comes through our accounts and goes on.
That's about 9% of the
1.33
160 million.
1.33 million is a flipping large chunk of the total economy and environment section, which is the kind of the bit where we've basically got no choice about what we spend on social care. You know, that's statutory responsibilities and so forth. So what we're doing is finding a really quite a significant chunk of additional funding specifically for this. But obviously I would like to find more, and you'll hear that we could, for example, potentially borrow capital to spend more on, to invest in projects that could generate environmental and other social benefits. And actually the capital budget is where we've got a bit more wriggle room than revenue, because revenue is the money that comes in for the sort of day-to-day expenditure. And like I say, so much of that goes on social care. The 1.33 million, that's our proposal as an administration to put that forward. It's subject to vote by full council on the 11th of February. Okay. So we can't promise that. It's, you know, it's subject to full council vote. But
right. So that's
if it gets very strongly for that.
That's if it gets accepted. And Trevor asked, forgive me for asking it on your behalf. Trevor was asking, where is that money coming from, particularly?
So the 1.33 million, the reason we've kind of been able to articulate that and specifically say we'd like to put that to here is it's called the New Homes Bonus, and it's basically, it's a specific chunk of money that comes into, every council gets it depending on the new homes that have been built within a certain period of time. Previously we've allocated New Homes Bonus to things like fixing potholes, to things like building wetlands to deal with the phosphate pollution problems that we've got in the county, to things like exploring building sustainable transport infrastructure. That's what a lot of it was spent on last year. So each year it's a chunk of money that comes in that sort of isn't already automatically spoken for, and that's why we've tried to say for this year we really want to be able to put some additional funding into climate action. And like I say, it's not my personal decision, it's a full council decision, but we feel this agenda is so important, and your recommendations, you know, we'd like to be able to say they can directly influence a particular chunk of money. But I don't want you to get too focused just on the 1.33, because actually councils spend, like I've said, you know, millions of pounds every year, and they also spend millions and millions, tens of millions on capital expenditure every year. So there's lots of wider opportunities to influence what the council does, and then to influence what the county as a whole does as well.
Thank you, Councillor. I think you might be being shunted away in a moment, but we're happy to keep asking you questions while you're here, but I'm expecting, I think our time is up.
I'm happy to keep answering.
If anybody's got anything left over that wants to just jump in now, take the opportunity, please.
Yeah, I've just understood, John Jay, by the way, the discussion about the finances, but is it going to be sufficient to make an impact? I mean, in these things in the world, 1.3, whatever it was, million, isn't a very large sum of money.
So it's a really good question, John. You know, my answer would be we need to make sure that everything we spend and everything we do has climate awareness and climate action integrated into it. So, you know, no, spending 1.33 million isn't going to solve the climate crisis in Herefordshire, of course not. What it can do is help to catalyse new work. For example, one of the things that we've got to do is retrofit, insulate all the homes in Herefordshire, 85,000 of them. We can't do that with 1.33 million, but what we could do is set up a programme that subsidises training in retrofit for existing builders who are kind of to help promote them doing that. We could set up a system that helps people to get surveys done of their houses so they know what they need to do, how they can best spend limited funds to insulate and to save energy as much as possible. So do you see what I mean? It's the 1.33 could be a catalyst, but actually, again, my plea to you would be, don't get too kind of diverted just down that road, because actually, for example, if as a council we say every new house built in Herefordshire should be built to zero carbon standards, then that's not about us spending.
Oops.
we did warn about that, didn't we? So that's what happens if you go on too long. But the Councillor Challenge was trying to answer a very detailed question there, so apologies for the cut off there. Let's welcome our next speaker, Rachel.
Hello.
Welcome to Group B, I think we are. We've got a couple of questions. Brian, I think you actually asked this one as well. Do you want to ask the question about the impact of the oil in plastic, please?
Yes. So I was corrected by one of our panel that it was discussed as a lesser impact on the climate change. But I just wanted to understand the impact of the plastics in respect of the fact that they're made from oils, and that obviously that has got quite a
it's an interesting. So yes, you're right. Most plastic in its virgin form is just oil, and that's a really interesting thing. So one thing that economists are talking about a lot is something called the carbon bubble. So they're talking about the fact that lots of big companies have got balance sheets and all our pensions and so on are invested in them. I am coming to your question with this. It seems a bit tangential.
No, not at all.
We've got all our pensions invested in big companies, some of us that are reliant on oil reserves and things that can't be extracted and burned if we're to meet our carbon targets. We can't keep burning these fossil fuels, and yet in theory they're kind of valuable and they're on the balance sheets of these big companies. And this is for a long time been called the carbon bubble, but people are now starting to talk to it more about calling it unburnable carbon, because it's recognized that extracting oil is not necessarily something that has to end completely, because as you've pointed out, there are other uses for oil. Actually, the oil industry, parts of the petrochemical industry are quite important in pharmaceuticals, for example, and it's also a big part of making plastic, although we're constantly looking for other ways to make plastic so that it will be better and biodegradable. So the fact that oil is extracted and used to make plastic, the extraction of oil itself, that process and the running of oil refineries, yes, energy is used in doing that, and yes, it results in emissions. But in theory, you could run a sort of coal field off solar power. Do you know what I mean? All the machinery that's used to dig coal out of the ground or to dig oil out, that could be, solar powered. So there probably will still continue to be, in a perfect world, if we'd phased out burning all the fossil fuels, you could imagine that people would still be extracting fossil fuels in smaller amounts for other applications, and plastics and petrochemical uses like that may well be among them. But what we don't see is that the production and poor management of plastic itself is not a major driver. If you had a pie chart for all the world's emissions came from, be huge amounts from heating buildings, huge amounts from vehicular traffic, huge amounts from deforestation and so on. And there will be a tiny slice in there somewhere that's the making of plastic and the disposing of plastic. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Was there anything else on plastic before we kind of move on to the other topic?
Question, but that's for Rachel.
Yeah, go on.
In terms of percentage, so I just wanted to understand what sort of percentage, and I know we're hanging on this plastic thing, but what sort of percentage of recyclables from a household waste are actually recycled, and whether that can be improved?
It depends. It does depend where you live. Yes. So one of the things we need to move towards from a climate point of view is something that feels what people talk about as a circular economy, where you sort of assume that everything at the end of its life has a value and can be used again. And the generally accepted view is that if a council like Herefordshire is recycling less than 65% of its waste, then it's properly recycling it. Then it's nowhere near a circular economy. Too much of that is kind of leaching out and becoming real waste, as it were. I don't know the figures on how much of Herefordshire's plastic is collected and recycled, but what I know is that even the best councils in the UK aren't achieving the levels that the best councils in places like Germany's are. And I don't know that Herefordshire is even up there in the kind of league tables, as it were. But I would really urge you not to be caught up on plastic and household waste. Waste is a relatively small part of any houses and household and communities footprint. And that's actually an area that, partly because of EU regulation, we have improved on greatly in the last 20 years. Heating our buildings and stopping our buildings being so leaky and phasing out burning stuff to move our vehicles around are much, much bigger things that we as individuals, households and communities could be doing to tackle the climate crisis.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Brian.
Can I ask Rachel a different question?
Yes, well, I was going to come on to the China and India question, which somebody asked. Does somebody want to ask that one?
No, I didn't ask that one, so.
Okay, well, John, if you got one for Rachel, jump in now. And
okay, Rachel put up a slide about and quoted the USA about how much of this man-made fertilizer is used and the devastating nitrous oxide effect it has. My question is, in Herefordshire, or the UK first, how much do we use? Are we like the Americans?
Yes, in the change, in the terms of that change, we, again, like all industrialized nations, you know, you may remember the talk of the Green Revolution in the 1960s. Yeah. That was the point really at which people were being very, very concerned about population growth at that point. And that was partly because agriculture wasn't as kind of industrialized as it is now, and there was a genuine concern that the people of the world couldn't be fed, and so that it was kind of cheered on really that we'd started developing fertilizers in this much more intensive way using nitrogen, and that everything became very synthetic, and Britain and the rest of Europe jumped on that bandwagon just as much, and it went hand in hand with the growth of the average farm size as well that we saw both in the US and in Europe. So yes, it is, you know, several 100% more synthetic fertilizer than it was in 1960.
And have we got any data on Herefordshire? Is the second part.
Specifically, I don't have that data for Herefordshire, but yes, I would suggest Herefordshire's not largely an arable county, so the chances are, compared to other places like Essex, fertilizer use here is lower because fertilizer use is always higher on arable farms. But that doesn't necessarily mean that where arable is happening in Herefordshire, it's all organic or whatever, like, you know, it's all on non-synthetic.
Thanks, Rachel. We've got about a minute left. If anybody's got a quick final question.
Is there any further explanation on what the F gases are and whether we've got anything that we could look at to address that?
Yes, so actually the EU is already looking into phasing them out. There are alternatives. I'm not that knowledgeable about them, but there are alternatives, and regulatory work is already underway Europe-wide to start phasing them out. It's a solvable problem, but one that we need to get on with.
Can I ask another one quickly?
Paula,
I might just get booted out
because
suddenly.
She hasn't asked one yet. Paula, very quickly, even if you don't get to answer it, but do you want to just unmute yourself? We'll capture these questions if we can't answer them.
What I was wondering is that, don't you think that from Hereford's perspective, we need to start sweating the small?
Sorry, I'm so sorry, Paula. This has happened to you twice now. We're going to capture that and we'll pass it on to Rachel at the end. So you're just very, very unlucky there to get the very last question. But hold that question. But let's grab it before we finish the session and write it down in the document and make sure that's passed over to. We've got our final speaker, Paul Allen. Welcome. And we've got one question to start with, and then we might throw in the general question to you. Who was asking the question about carbon capture and storage? Would you like to present?
It was me, I'm afraid.
Want to ask that one?
Yeah, sure. You mentioned in the presentation the capability of carbon capture, and I just wondered where are we up to on that? What are the most effective ones? What impact they have, and what's coming in the future?
Well, I think the most important thing is to recognise that we have to make big changes to how we live. We have to live on much more energy efficient ways of delivering society's goals and make big switches to clean energy sources. So the amount of emissions that we have to deal with through carbon capture is brought down to about 9–10%, because there's so much stuff talked about just buying offsets and bolting PVs and electric cars to business as usual. The amount of net negative carbon capture that requires is enormous. Now, the machines for doing it, it's unproven at scale and unproven at cost. And it's also something that isn't they say is going to start happening in 10, 20 years' time. If we don't do the heavy lifting, then we're passing a burden on to future generations with very unproven and very costly technologies to capture the carbon that was released because we didn't do what we could do now. So what we think about, we call real zero, which means actually doing the heavy lifting, getting it down to about the final 9–10%, and then by doubling forest cover, revitalizing all those peat bogs that were drained, we can make nature's healthy organs come to a point where they can capture some carbon with natural carbon capture. But we can't be selling off farms to plant trees, wrong places, to create carbon certificates that can be used just to try and offset wasteful fossil fuel business as usual, so somebody can have a little green stamp on their business marketing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yes, especially that last bit, because I always feel when I read about that or whatever, there's a bit of a con going on rather than addressing the real problem.
Yes, I agree.
Paul, there was a general question, not directly directed directly to you, but how would you answer the China and India question?
What is the China and India question?
It's all very well us doing lots to reduce our emissions, but what about China and India? They've got even more, and what are they doing?
Well, you've got to look at emissions per head, per citizen. China and India have big emissions because they've got an awful lot of people living there, and the carbon footprint of the people who live in those countries is a lot less than it is in Britain. So the developing world need to be able to have resilient, reliable ways of providing warm houses and food and transport. And basically, they aren't responsible for the huge amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere. We are. So we have to pull down our emissions to allow space for them to come up so we can reach some sort of global equity. But it's so often said that countries are the largest emitter, but if a country's got a third of the world's population living there, then it's going to have large emissions. It's the emissions per head that we have to look at, and the recognition of the majority world's right to live a modern, comfortable lifestyle.
Thanks, Paul. Does anybody have any other questions? The floor is yours.
Yes, I would have thought total emissions is the important thing. No, not per head.
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Okay, Paul?
It's the emissions per head, in my opinion, because we've got all of the citizens of the world, and if you look at the global equity that's required, then we need to bring that sort of amount of energy we use to some sort of parity, because it's not really just what you call a group of people, it's how much emissions they give each. Why do you think it's just down to country name, regardless of the size of country?
I think the global warming is due to the total amount of carbon dioxide, irrespective of where it comes from.
Yes, of course it is. And where it comes from is emissions per citizen, really, regardless of what you might call the boundaries or move the boundaries. It's down to us all to live a carbon equitable lifestyle, but to maximize the core benefits of having a more meaningful lifestyle, having more active mobility and better diets and reduced fuel poverty and all of the benefits that we can have in the process.
Thanks, Paul. There's time for one more question. Anything on some of the wicked solutions that Paul talked about?
Which one? Sorry.
Sophie, go on.
Yeah. So you touched on very quickly consumerism and buying like phones and things breaking quickly and things like that. And I was just wondering, really, like, should we stop sort of like buying phones and cheap technology and things like that from places like China that set up new factories all the time, new coal factories, which I understand, because those developing countries they have a right to get to where we got to. Just because we got there a long time ago doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to. But yeah, do we need to become more self-reliant, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Sorry,
Yeah.
I know we're
time.
Yes, I think we do. We need to increase more local manufacturing, but we also need to legislation that means the things that are built, washing machines, fridges, phones, whatever, are designed to last as long as possible. Then they're designed to be repairable, and then they're designed to be recyclable. And the designer obsolescence is absolutely everywhere. Everything from your fridge to your phone is designed to break much, much earlier than it needs to, because it's good for the business model.
Yeah.
So we need to regulate on that and make sure that stuff's built to last. And we also see repair cafes springing up in towns and cities across the world where people are helping citizens fix stuff so they don't have to throw it away.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Thanks, Sophie. And thanks, Paul. We are going to be booted out in about 10 seconds. So just an opportunity to say thank you for coming along and answering the questions. And thanks, everybody, for asking.
Thank you.
See you back in the big room.